There we are. It should be live. Hey, everyone. Good to see you here. Scotland, Hawaii, Mexico, Estados Unidos. Bienvenidos. Let's talk about pictorialism today. And in today's workshop, this isn't going to need to be super long, but in today's first pictorialism workshop, I want to set some foundations. We're going to edit some photos. I actually just did a shoot over the weekend of some portraits, but I shot with a pictorialism mindset in mind, and we're going to look at that a little closer today. Now, whoops, hang on. Let me make sure I don't have any echoes, get rid of any extra sound problems. This video, let's see here we go. There's that, and there we go. I think I got it. Now, when you think about pictorialism, and I'll let you guys get in there as I just kind of get us kicked off here today. Pictorialism can be landscapes, street, people. It can be ethereal images of models or people in flowing gowns. Sometimes the early pictorialism was some of the first stage scenes. So remember, this is before movies were being made and Hollywood and all that. And so the idea of pictorialism was that, hey, we inherited this profession from the painters, and we should be doing creative things with it, not simply taking rigid photos of people, mounted in a head brace so we can take their likeness. That's not how painters did portraits. And so the pictorialists, who were at odds a little bit with the natural photographers, were saying, it's about the artistic merits. And they would do things to make them look like drawings and like paintings. And sometimes it would mean doing things in the darkroom, mixing chemicals in different ways, or doing really gritty processes in how they printed. Sometimes it meant setting up scenes. There's actually a great video on pictorialism by Ted Forbes that he has on his YouTube channel, where he does a lot of videos on photography history. And Ted also has a pretty good Pinterest board. If you look up his Pinterest, which you can find on that video. I'll link that video below, because if you want to understand more about kind of the foundation of pictorialism, I don't have a history of pictorialism video at the moment, and Ted's video is great. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at different images, and I'm actually going to talk about how I shoot and edit for pictorialism, and how you can too, and how thinking about the detail of pictorialism is how you change the way that you see. Okay, so we talk about in my Shadows Hackers workshop how you see shadow, not just light, and you put shadow first, actually. Today we're going to focus on the detail, and how more detail isn't always better, and how pictorialism can teach us how to work with that. Now, I'm going to be using my new pictorialist actions, and some of you watching this may have those, some of you may not. Those will of course be linked. That said, to do pictorialism and understand the concepts today, you don't need to use my tools. I've just spent months studying this and building a kit to say, okay, how can we replicate and get that pictorialist feel in Photoshop, but in a way that's really flexible. Okay, so let me know if you're hearing okay, if you're seeing okay. We should have a nice clean stream, and let's jump right into this. Now, if you look at pictorialism, we're going to be looking at a few different elements. You could look at someone like Stieglitz, like Robert Demachi. And what you see is a lot of these. If you look these up, you see a lot of sometimes these kind of cinematic stage scenes, but a lot of times just very painterly movement, motion, like a lot happening. Leonard Masson is another one that I mentioned in the last video. He always had these very ethereal, beautiful scenes that almost seemed like they were highly detailed drawings. The beauty of pictorialism is you can do these very dramatic things of very simple photos. In fact, I'm going to show you in a minute how I've been going back to photos from years ago that didn't ever quite click. They weren't quite enough. But when I think of them and edit them and look at them as a pictorial, the whole perspective changes. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. But I like to look at the pictorialists, and then you have pictorialists that are more modern, like Orton, like David Hamilton, and Orton would use stacking of slides, one blurry and one not, different exposure levels. David Hamilton would do these really beautiful kind of ethereal, often controversial photos of models. I'm trying to look here because David Hamilton did a lot of nudes. And so when you look up David Hamilton, that was a lot of his work. And you see, though, that he always had, people said he used like Vaseline on the lens. I'm sure he used many different techniques, but his was more of a color 70s, 80s style of pictorialism that was just beautiful in the way that he did it. And it's pretty legendary. In fact, one of the reasons I started doing Pictorialist as an action set is somebody came to me, one of the users of my products, and said, "Hey, do you think we could do David Hamilton kind of looks? Because it's very difficult and complicated." And when I heard difficult and complicated, I thought, okay, let's go to work on this, because I can do the difficult and complicated, like difficult and complicated in Photoshop or anywhere else is kind of one of my areas of expertise. I'm actually just looking at some of my archives of Hamilton photos that aren't too over the top, just to kind of see. And you can certainly go look at his work, but I don't want YouTube to flag my video right off the get-go here. So I will just... But you can see that he always had this kind of rich glow, and you'll see this if you use Pictorialist and if you use the Hamilton effect in Pictorialist, but it doesn't mean your photos are always going to look like his. The way he set his poses, the way he uses light. The goal when I created Pictorialist wasn't, hey, we're going to copy all these looks exactly. It was that we get these tools, because blurs are not what you think they are. But let's go to a few photos. In fact, let's go to this session that I was just working on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you would edit pictorials. Now, if I go to this session here that I just shot of our model here over the weekend, this was just very casual, nothing crazy. And I'm going through, these are raw edits that I've then gone and used like Filmist on. And that's usually what I'll do on a session. I will always do my basic color grade, my raw edit first before I go to Pictorialist. So I'm starting in Lightroom, I'm starting in Capture One. Now, the first question I get from people, can we do these Pictorialist looks in Lightroom, in Capture One? Well, no, not like we do in Photoshop. A pictorial doesn't mean all editing, right? A pictorial is kind of a thought process. A pictorial is saying we want emotion in our photos, that photos should have feeling. And that was my whole foundation, because for most of my career, I've done wall portraits and always sought detail and resolution and sharpness in my lenses. And of course, that's not irrelevant. There's a time for that. But sometimes you want motion, you want a blur. I remember one of my first gigs was speedway photography at a racetrack, and I learned early on to do these really good panning motion blurs. And some of those photos really caught people's eye, and it kind of helped me launch me as a photographer. But they weren't the sharpest photos, right? I was panning for a second sometimes, half a second on a racetrack, and I got really good at it. And I would get these streaking cars shooting down the motor speedway. And so as my career progressed and I started studying wall portraits and trying to do these really high-res landscapes, and then I came back and I'm using, vintage cameras and old lenses and all this stuff, and thinking, okay, we live in an AI digital age. The lenses are so sharp, everything's so sterile. What do we need? We need feeling, especially in this AI age where practically every viral photo you see is fake. And I mean that. Most of these viral photos you see of northern lights, of the eclipse, the ones you saw going around were faked. They were just made in AI, and no one cares because the pages promoting them that say National Geographic on them are not actually National Geographic. They're spam pages that are just getting likes and profiting off people sharing these photos that have no basis. Now, if we look at this here, when I went to a session, when you go to shoot for Pictorialism, and when I went out on this week's session, I thought, okay, let's shoot for Pictorialism. And when I say that, I mean more than just saying, let's do a blur, right? I mean, let's go in and take a photo like this one, okay? Here's a photo. I actually went back to a session from years ago. This was not a photo I picked. It's kind of this interesting pose. The eyes are closed. It's just a light filmist kind of process. But then I said, hold on. As a pictorialist, my perspective changes because now I can go in and I can do like a Stieglitz or a Coburn. I can use texture and grit. And what we're actually doing with this texture and grit, and if you go back to the pictorialists that we see that I showed you at the beginning of the video, if you study them, what you actually realize is that they're using grit and dark edges and all this stuff, not because they couldn't take a sharp photo then with those early lenses. They could. There was good optics then. They may not have been as prolific as now. But the cameras weren't bad in these days. They were shooting large format in the early 1900s. You could get beautiful images. They were doing this intentionally to draw attention to the subject and create emotion. So let's go to this here. And I went into Photoshop, and we'll come back to it, and I did this. And notice how all this detail, how everything kind of fades away, right? We have this natural scene, these wide natural scenes, not always of people looking at the camera, not always of people at all, but if you're doing portraits, go out on your sessions and take some of them walking away from the camera. Take some of them moving, maybe a little bit of motion blur. Lower that shutter speed down to a 50th or a 60th of a second, whereas normally you would shoot at 1/25th or 2/50th, maybe even a 30th. Have them do a spin and have the hands blurred or the fabric blurred. What you're doing is creating a sense of emotion of what you're feeling in that scene, right? You have a model, she's in a dress, she feels like dancing. Well, okay, you take a photo of her dancing, maybe it's not that exciting. But if you have the movement of her dancing and then you edit that with this emotion that's almost a fantasy world, now you're taking her emotion and you're bringing it to the image. Come back to this. And I actually just did this today, and I said, you know what, I have to do a workshop because we have to talk about this. It's not simply a question of clicking actions. And what I was actually going for in this mix, and I'll show you if you want, but what I was going for in this mix was kind of the Misson look where he had this very almost hand-drawn effect. And I just did this with the tools that are already in right now in Pictorialist Actions. But you could do this manually with black and white conversions, with textures, with adjusting curves. You're actually kind of making the photo lo-fi. And look at the drama we're getting in this versus this photo here. Now, there's nothing wrong with our photo. It was a nice shoot. But this is now a fine art print, and it has some feeling. There's thought. You can tell that our model's thinking something. Are you seeing what I'm saying here? Throw your questions in here. Whether you're a pictorialist user or not, I don't care. We're talking today about this, and I want to talk more about this because I think it has a ton of potential right now in this AI world. We need photos with more feeling. Have you noticed that all these AI photos, everybody's changing skies and adding in light, and everything's fake. There's no feeling. Even the people photos that are AI-ified, they're soulless. There's something in a photo when you do it well. And this is the first time I've done this workshop, and it's probably going to be a little rough, and I will probably do more along these lines in the future because I really sat down today. I was thinking about how I was using Pictorialist and all the great feedback I'm getting from you guys that have bought my Pictorialist actions, and I'm like, okay, what else can we do? It's not about the actions. It's not even about how you're editing. You can do this manually, but it's a little complicated. There's just sometimes a lot of layers, and we really got to stop and say, okay, what do I want to do? With a vertical editing process, well, let's go to a photo. Rather than talk, I will show, because that's always going to be more powerful, okay? So let me come back to our session that we were working on. Okay, so let's go to our session and go back to the session I did on Saturday. Hang on, let me find it here, right here. Okay, so here's our session. Let me just take our 5 stars so we don't overdo this. And here we are. Now, we're not going to edit all of these because this isn't a workflow workshop. What I want to do is I took photos like this one here, right? Here's the photo. And now I come in and I say, all right, it's not the greatest lighting. And I did use strobes on this shoot as well, but this one is, you know, you can see that there's a little movement. It's a little cluttered. That's where pictorialism comes in, because I can come in here, this is the Hamilton effect, and this is Hamilton Rich, I believe. But what are we actually doing? We're softening, we're getting glows around the highlights, we're blurring. Now, let's go to another one, and let's actually go edit one here. Let's take one that was actually pretty good out of camera. This is a nice photo here. Again, I went to a Hamilton look. We're softening while still retaining facial detail. This is really trying to kind of channel that natural ethereal glow. And you're going to see this more on some than on others. First of all, I just want to show you a few. See this? It's a little plain. She's kind of getting lost in the foliage. What is the effect doing here? We're maintaining, even though she's still dark, she becomes more the focal point, and the image becomes more ethereal and dreamlike and emotion as she's standing in these sunset trees. And I just want you to kind of look at these different ones, but let's go edit something. By the way, this applies equally to landscapes, right? Here's one I took of the trees at the sunset, and then I did the Orton effect on it. Now, if at a glance, you might not feel that, oh, I didn't do anything too radical. This isn't a super intense pictorialist, but it brings out kind of this warm, natural glow, and yet you still have detail in the frame. And I think that's important. Let's go and actually edit a few of these, though. Let me go down to one I haven't edited. Look at these here. I want to show you like these 4, okay? And you can see how a lot of these have kind of some blur. This is kind of soft. You can see the movement in her feet. Now, if I go to the raw, let me show you the raw file of this. At a glance, this is the kind of photo, I think, that a lot of times in a session, let me get the right one, a lot of times in a session we might throw away, right? The face isn't there. Hey, we're photographing a model. You can't see her face. There's blurriness. And yet, when I think as a pictorialist, first of all, I'm looking for shadow. I'm looking for how shadow and light combine and illuminate things and create drama, right? That's zones and shadow hacking and those kind of things that I talk about a lot here on the channel. But with pictorialism, you're adding another element. Whether you're going for color, whether you're going for black and white, it doesn't really matter. You're adding this element of motion, of more drama, of dream world, of fantasy a little bit. Sometimes even a little more staged, like some of the earlier pictorialists did. But when I do pictorialism, I'm kind of focusing on not being so razor sharp. This doesn't mean I'm not focusing. It doesn't mean that I blur everything. But sometimes you can get actually really interesting effects by doing that. And I've learned that all throughout my career. If I turn the shutter speed down and start blurring with things, my hit rate is going to plummet, right? If I'm shooting at a 250th of a second and I'm taking portraits and I got a strobe and the model's moving and we're doing outfits, I'm going to get lots of nice photos. But am I going to get anything that's just incredible or that really speaks to me or to you or the viewer or to my model? Or a landscape, let's say, or a street photo? Not necessarily. So when I turn my shutter speed down to, say, a 30th of a second on the streets or of a model, things start getting really blurry, and most of the shots don't hit. But sometimes you get something that just works. And so I was mixing that in with this session and actually thinking as a pictorialist. And when you look here, it's kind of like, okay, it's a blurry photo of a model. But when you take more of this gritty Stieglitz look, I think it gets a lot more interesting. Now, we get into very subjective things when we start talking about fine art prints and stuff like that. The nuances of how you do it are significant. And not everything has to be blurry or intense or super soft, right? I'm taking pictorialist effects like Stieglitz and I'm using them on fairly normal portraits, right? But I'm using that to help draw the eye, to really help the lines. Look at our lines here. I was specifically looking at this curve of this tree and then of her arm, kind of framing in there, in between. And then I thought, okay, I could do a color here, but let's do kind of that platinum Stieglitz kind of look. Let's actually go edit something though. Let's take one that's not done yet. So let's take this, right? Sun is setting. Got a lot of chromatic aberration coming from this. What lens was this? This was a 50 mil. No, this was a 35 mil Olympus lens, I believe. So it's an old 70s lens, and that's why we're getting all that chromatic aberration around here. But we're gonna go black and white on this. So let's actually go here. I'm gonna go into Photoshop with this. Now, I'm gonna be using Pictorialist because with Pictorialist, I'm doing edits that would quite literally oftentimes take an hour to kind of build and experiment, even for a Photoshop expert. Like you have to move and you adjust blending modes and all this stuff. But I'm gonna, as much as possible, kind of describe what we're seeing so that if you're just manually editing, you can create these kind of edits yourself. Let's look at this though. If I come here, now is the idea, let me run, I'm gonna start by the run first pictorialist action. If you've watched the pictorialist training videos, you already know this. You see not a lot changes, but it sets up all these layers. I have a detail control, a paper softness control, things like that. And so it sets up kind of all my baselines here. And then I'm gonna go ahead and let's go straight. I could do like a Hamilton on this, but I'm gonna go straight to Stieglitz. I'm gonna run Stieglitz. So the green one, we're in button mode in the actions. The green one is our parent action. of the Stieglitz look, and then we have these mods underneath. So we have to run the main one first. So now we have this. Let's go to Stieglitz Tarnish, okay, and go here. And notice what's happening here. First of all, the chromatic aberration isn't really a problem anymore because we're in a monochrome image. But we're intentionally adding this grittiness, this kind of dirty paper feel. We're making the scene a little more ghost story-ish, of this model standing looking out here under the tree. Everything becomes a little more mysterious and focused. Let me turn off. Here's our before and after. But I want you to think about this. I don't want people to think that pictorialism is, oh, we just got to make it look junky, right? We just got to make it look blurry. We got to use textures. What's actually happening, and if you study the pictorialists, whether it be Stieglitz or Masson or any of these people, yes, they're kind of going lo-fi. They're reducing detail, but it's not about saying, let's make it blurry. It's about utilizing the lack of detail, the imperfections, to draw focus to the subject and to present that subject in a more emotional state. That is, this is kind of a fairly plain photo of a model just standing in the pine needles, right? And this has mystery. We don't exactly know what's happening. This goes back to the photo I often show in my Shadow Hackers workshop, where it's reversed. The model is darker than the surrounding scene, and she's looking down this road that goes to blackness. If you lift the shadows in that photo, it's a lot less exciting because there's no mystery. So what you're doing is you're creating emotion. The idea with a pictorial, and the idea when you're shooting for pictorials, should not be, I can take kind of mediocre, crappy photos, and then I can come back to those and just edit the daylights out of them and call them fine art. I don't want us to think that way. That's not what the pictorialists were doing. They were planning. They were doing a lot of work in editing. They were adjusting, and that's what we're doing here. What I just did with this in Pictorialists, and let's look for those that aren't using it, look what's happening here. First of all, let me get it in here. Look at the layers. So we have this kind of base point. Here's a sharpening layer, right? We're then combining that with a vignette layer here. This is the icon edges from Pictorialists. Then we're using textures, scratched glass, tarnish, blurred tarnish. So I'm mixing all these layers, and you'll see, notice how they each have different blending modes, different opacities. They're then put within groups so I can turn them on and off, right? Notice how I can turn on and off the texture group, for example. But more realistically, I could turn the opacity up and down. What we're doing in Pictorialists is I'm putting all these things in place that can then easily be adjusted either by other actions that are built into Pictorialist, or you can come and do it manually. And notice how we can change glows and details and all this different stuff that's happening. I feel like I'm bogging down a little bit here. What's going on? There we go. Okay, so you can see I have mist layers. This is kind of my blurs. If I turn this on and off, you see detail change. I can increase paper softness, right? Notice how this affects the glows. So some of these blurs, that it's not always fair to call them blurs, because you notice the image isn't getting that blurry. It's affecting more the highlights and how they blend with the shadows. So when you see all these things mixing in, what's happening is as you stack these layers, this is why you can't do this in Lightroom. You can't do this with a one layer deep raw edit. Here we have a curve, one's the darker mood. And so these are all being built as the actions are running. We have a black and white conversion map, which could be changed, right? I could turn this on and off, and here's the color. This is converting everything to black and white. We have the real grain layers, which are actually using raw grain, but also real grain from scans that I put in here to make this as authentic as possible. So what you're doing is you're combining Am I back? I think it's back. What you're doing, sorry, I lost my camera battery there. We should be back. Let me know in the comments if you guys are still hearing this. I know we're a small group today because most of the world is still not doing pictorialism. If you're here, you're already on the bleeding edge. Pictorialism is something that was the early 1900s of photography, and now we have AI and artificial skies and all that kind of stuff. And that's exactly why I'm focusing on it, because I've realized that it really comes to connects to shadow hacking. It really connects to atmosphere and emotion. We're not going to make it as photographers, guys. I'm telling you this right now. We're not going to make it as photographers, the industry, if we don't start creating emotion. Because everything's being made artificially, right? Everything's being hacked in. Skies are faked. Eclipses are faked. People's faces are faked. Everything's being enhanced. People are even taking crappy, blurry photos, and you can enhance everything. The future of the photography is going to be those of us who understand how to capture the soul and how to create true emotion. Yes, we're going to see things, I'm sure, coming out on Facebook and social media where it detects if it's AI and it tells people, because people are being severely tricked right now by false images, even of like news in war-torn countries and things like that. And it's not okay. It's not okay to make a fake photo and lie about it. It's fine to make a composite photo and be honest about it. The beauty of pictorialism is it's not trying to say this is just a pure photo, right? But it is a photo. These are nothing here is AI generated. We're stacking and we're mixing and you're blending. And so if you're trying to make pictorialists yourself, like outside of using my pictorialist actions, and I don't know of anything else in the industry that does this, because no one's really talking about pictorialism in terms of its process that I know of on any large scale. We're going to change that, just like we did on this channel and made zones a thing. When I first started talking and teaching about zones, and I made the Expose workshop in 2011, no one was talking about zones. Now zones are being included in apps. They're becoming more and more mainstream because they're the language of tonality. Now, shadow hacking, these past 2 years, I've been really taking those zones, connecting them to shadow hacking. Now we're gonna take shadow hacking and connect that to atmosphere in the different ways we can make it. Pictorialism and understanding the emotion and atmosphere of your photos isn't always going to mean super intense, ethereal kind of looks. That's not always what it's about. But when you understand that, when you understand how to create that kind of emotion in a photo and to see that as you're capturing, you're going to get a completely different feeling in your images, even in the ones that you're leaving sharp and you're printing on big canvases and things like that, because you're going to start to understand the emotion of a photo. Now, I'll keep working on this session, but you kind of get the idea as I've gone through, I've edited this, and then I've taken my best ones and taken them in and worked them in Photoshop a little bit. And you can see, take a photo like this, right? Let's turn it up a third of a stop on the exposure. Again, just a raw file, film as preset on this. Let's take this straight into Photoshop and just see what we can do really quick, right? What we have is this photo that's a little blurry, and we want to make that blur feel intentional. We want the focus to be on the motion through this path in the forest, right? So let's go to a Coburn. So I'm going to run the Coburn action, and it's going to build up all my layers and stack and textures. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go do Coburn Deep, right? And you can see how we tend to get dark, we get mistiness, we get these mixes that are a bit intense. And our normal photographer brains say, oh, that's too much. But then again, what are we trying to create? What's the emotion we're trying to feel? It doesn't mean every photo needs to be kind of this abstract sort of feel, right? That's not necessary. I can go and I can take a photo that was genuinely blurry that I wouldn't have used, and I can do a pictorial process and use those textures, and it changes it, right? It's like, okay, this is kind of interesting because it's a blurry photo of someone walking on the beach. It introduces mystery. Whereas before, it was just like, oh, you screwed up. Now, again, let me emphasize, I'm not saying be lazy in camera. I never emphasize being lazy in camera. What I'm saying is connect the two. The more you're thinking about these nuances in camera, you start asking yourself, well, wait a minute, this is great. I got some great photos, but what if I start turning the shutter speed down, right? What if it's darker and we add more shadow hacking? What if it's a little blurry? They're walking, they're running. What if we blur them? Some of the greatest photos ever in history are the imperfect ones. And it's really important, I think, that we understand that. Let's go to some other examples. Let me go to my little pictorialist set for today for the workshop and just see, what do you do with that? Here's a photo here. This is actually the poster photo for Pictorialist. This was taken with a vintage lens. It's not real sharp. In fact, our model's a bit soft. And yet in the final version, it works because there's this drama surrounding it. And it brings out those tones, that separation of shadows. Let's find another one that we haven't edited yet. Let's take something fairly normal, right? So if we take, I was looking at the Saul Letter's work, right, on this Pinterest. And I was thinking about like Saul Letter's book, like In My Room, and Saul Letter did these kind of a little bit more modern than the early pictorialists, kind of a street photography kind of approach. But you'll notice how he has a lot of movement blurs. There's things in the way, right? There's people doing life, and I think that's what's important here. There's people doing life. There's feeling, and it's mixing oftentimes with blurs. It's not trying to be the sharpest. It's trying to convey the feeling of whatever was happening. And I was thinking of this kind of stuff in terms of like some of my behind the scenes photos. Let's actually go to something. Can I show this on YouTube? I think there's not. It's showable on YouTube. Okay, so let's take this and do like this behind the scenes photo of getting ready. Now I already converted this to black and white, right, and silver. It looks fine. But if I'm trying to do this kind of soft behind the scenes photo book, let's say, pictorialism gives me a perspective that's different. So for example, I'm going to do the run first. Let's run the pictorialist base. Let's run Stieglitz. Okay, and let's run Stieglitz tarnish. Notice how each step, now we're getting this grittiness and all the details are falling off. Everything becomes these strong, stark shadows where you're seeing our model in 3 different angles, from the back, from one side, and from the other side, because of the mirrors here, right? And think about this. Now watch what's happening. We're getting kind of this and the reason I put this in here is it kind of reminded me of a kind of Saul Letter kind of look. It's not trying to be sharp. It was a very impromptu kind of prepping image for the session that was being worked on. And it softens down all of the bottles on the counter, the makeup, all the things that are happening. It introduces this grit. Now we could do that more. Let me put the whetstone surface on this from Pictorialist, and we add even more to this. Now, let's switch this to hard light. This is, for those of you not using Pictorialist, this is what I want you to understand. You add a texture, let's say, and then you change the blending modes. And then I could change and go to that texture, and this is something I was working on today, and go to the levels of that texture. So if I turn up the levels of that texture, right, it gets more and more rustic and rough. Now it's too much, right? But we can turn it down. We don't have to use it 100%. So we can use it to bring in softening of detail and make it look like a very kind of low, grainy behind the scenes. I think it's a little too much for this, and I'm going to leave this off. The reason I threw that in there is because I used it on an image earlier, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And by mixing, the way I discover things in Pictorialist, and actually what I just showed you, I'm working on actually a Masson combination, a Leonard-Masson combination. And so I'm experimenting with different mixes and how to get that kind of almost charcoal kind of texture to it. And then that will be implemented into a future update of Pictorialist. And so let me know if this is coming across, because this is the first time that I have done this particular class. And I'm really trying to convey in this video, there's already a video on my site, guys, of how to use Pictorialist. If you go to the Pictorialist page, which is linked right here in the chat, you can check out samples, you can watch hands-on videos, how to install it, all that. I'm using Pictorialist, I realize that, but I'm trying to really convey to you the thought process that making a pictorial is about seeing emotion. So you're out and you're taking photos, and I don't care if you're at a sports game, right? I know FitzCam shoots sports, you do a lot of video, and I'll check with you later on that question, Fitz. And you have this emotion. You're always trying to convey emotion. So we go out, but sometimes we get so hung up on the lighting, the positioning. Is it Rembrandt? Is it split? You know, what's our ratios? And we should know all that kind of stuff. And I teach that in Exposed. I talk about using shadow for drama and shadow hackers. This stuff's important. But what I'm trying to convey with pictorialism, zones are the technical side, right? Shadow hacking merges the technical with shadow and tone and kind of merges the right and left brain. Pictorialism really swings over into the artistic side. It uses those other two things, but you can really do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. Let's come back to this photo, and I want to show you how I made this one. So here's the raw, right? Raw photo, tennis shoes on our model, right? Simple crop, basic raw process. This sat here for years. I never used this photo until today, actually. We're going to take it in here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to run Pictorialist, okay? And I'm just going to run Hamilton on this just for fun. I know that's not where we're going for this. And the more we visualize in camera, the better. But I could run Hamilton. I could then do the New York Hamilton mod. Understand when I run one of these actions, it's running a whole bunch of these actions below it. So it's doing hundreds of steps to build all these layers. And so I'm getting this really cool, nice photo. But actually where I think I want to go with this is a very mysterious, dramatic black and white, like a Stieglitz, like a Coburn, like a Masson. All right? Because I want this kind of fairy dancing in the forest. I'm going to go up here and I'm just going to reset. So I'm going to get rid of everything we've done. And I'm going to go straight to Stieglitz. Let's run Stieglitz. And then I'm going to do the tarnish mix. So Stieglitz looks good. But by the tarnish mix, what we're actually doing is we're bringing in some of these textures. It's just automating the process, right? We're putting scratchiness. And by the way, I can go down here, and I frequently will, to the layers and say, no, I don't want that much. I want to turn it up and down. Let's turn a layer on and off and see how I can control how much of this, right? I can make that scratchiness kind of, it's there, but the viewer doesn't really know what it is, or I can make it more distinct, like we actually had a scratched negative paper, etc. Okay? Think about that as you're editing. Textures are very important, and I've made a texture pack. My Naked Textures texture pack has borders. It has, true film borders. It has textures from parchments that are 150 years old and from stone. And so you can actually do more, and you can use that to add textures. A lot of you use my Naked Textures from the site, and it goes perfectly alongside this. But I've built in some of these textures into Pictorialism to make this process really fluid, because I've learned that if you have to go through 100 steps to edit everything, you're not going to do that on every session. You'll notice that I'm coming in here. I've spent 2 clicks to get to where I'm at now. Now let's go a little further. Let's add the whetstone surface here. This will be automated in the future, by the way. So what have we done? We've now added more grit and more texture to this. I'm going to turn this down a little bit. I think it's a little too much right here. Let's do the micro blender. This is another new mod that I'm working on here. And it even softens. This is actually, the micro blender is actually inspired by Masson's work. And you see what it's doing. I explained it in last week's video, and show you how to make it. But notice how it's giving this texture that's very almost charcoal and painterly. And yet our model's retaining sharpness. You see this? This is the key here, is blurs aren't always blurs. We're blurring and we're stacking, and then we're mixing those with blending mode, just like an Orton effect. In an Orton effect, you have a blurry layer, and then you have a sharp layer, and you adjust exposures, and you use blending modes. You can watch videos. These aren't secrets of how to make them in film or in digital. But notice what's happening. Look at this photo here that we've just created. This is something I would print. There's nothing wrong with the initial photo, right? But it's a girl that's in a kind of sheer top, and she's just standing there. This, I feel like, is a dream. Like, now I feel what I was trying to get with this pose. Imagine this for a second. This is what Pictorialism is going to do. When you get your head into this, it's not about saying, like, have her twirl and blur it. Everything needs to be blurry. Now I'm a pictorialist, right? No. You might do that, and you should experiment because it'll open your eyes. I'm a very detail-oriented person. I like 40 megapixel sensors and big 70-inch prints, okay? So I'm what most people would call a pixel peeper. And this is very good for me in particular because it makes me analyze, hey, it's not always about the most detail. There's not a lack of detail in this photo. I could print this large. Look at her eyelashes. We still have detail, right? But look at this photo. And you tell me, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm just feeling the emotion that I felt when I was doing the photo. But that's okay. That's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to convey the feeling. I think pictorialism is really about creating feeling in our photos. Feeling before technical perfection, which is not to say ignoring light or tone or technical perfection. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Spare me. Talking to the stove repair guy. And when you understand that, what happens is, yes, you'll start shooting differently, okay? And you notice here, if we look at what I just made here in Photoshop, let me go back to the one I made earlier this afternoon here. Okay, let's look at the two. Here's the one I made earlier this afternoon, and here's the one. They're actually different. They're not even the same. This is the beauty when you do pictorialism, when you've got so much layers going on. Even though people think like, oh, it's an action, everything's gonna look the same. No, because every time you click one of these remixes, every time you add a mod, every time you adjust the opacity of a single layer, it actually affects all the layers around it, on top of it, because we're dealing with all these transparent layers. So I can completely change the whole aesthetic of the image by just adjusting one of the curve layers, by adjusting the glow layer. I can go back to color if I want to, right? Although I like this in black and white, but notice pictorialism doesn't mean color, it doesn't mean black and white, it doesn't mean Hamilton, it doesn't mean Stieglitz, it's a mindset. And that's why I said, no, yes, I'm going to use these actions. As I started building Pictorialists, I started with Hamilton and then started extending outward and studying more, and said, no, it doesn't mean color, it doesn't mean black and white, it means we feel, right? So we use these iconic photographers as an inspiration, but our photos, your photos, are still yours. Tell me if I'm crazy. You tell me if I'm making sense. I'm not getting enough feedback from you guys because I know I didn't do this one with a lot of advance notice. And so I know that it's today's was a little short notice. Let's take a landscape just to see, right? Let's do a completely opposite of these models and street photos and things like that. I'm going to turn this up just a little bit. Now, what do we have here? We have this cool scene of a bridge. I've edited this variants of this photo a few different ways along here. This is down in Jalitla, Mexico. All right, but what's happening is our shadow and the way it's mixing with the light, it's a little bit, I want to say, too cluttered. This is where pictorialism really comes in. I don't know what to do with this. Let's run the start action and let's just experiment really quick, okay? So let's say I do Hamilton, all right? I don't think this is what I'm going to want here. I think it's going to be a little too soft. Okay, so I'm going to run Hamilton, and no, this is a little too much. It's too like Vaseline on the lens kind of feel for this particular landscape. So let's reset, and let's do Orton. Okay, so I'm going to run Orton, and that'll give us a nice Orton effect. You can see it's building the glow layers and stacking down here, and then we have control over those. You can do it manually. This just makes it easy. Let's do the Orton contrast mix, which remixes those layers a little bit. Now let's go down here and do the icon edges. What's that going to do? It's basically a vignette, but it's a heavy one. It's going to darken those edges down and give me those nice darker edges. Now we're getting this kind of more dramatic feel. I'm going to snapshot this. This is something I'll often do on these more advanced edits, is I'll snapshot it unless I know exactly where I'm going. Like I have a visualization in my head, but it's okay to experiment. It helps us to push harder. Reset, and let's go to Coburn now. Let's do the Coburn black and white look, which is going to be a little more blurry, a little more intense. And then I'm going to do, this is interesting. Now we have this very kind of street photography, old school. There's blurring, there's motion. And sometimes, depending on your perspective, you might look and say, that's dumb. You're just ruining the photo. What I'm doing is adjusting and moving. I mean, I wish I just had a model like bathing on this log right here. This thing would be perfect. I would crop in the edges. Now when I go back there, I know what I want to do. So pictorialism is helping me discover ideas. It helps you see differently, right? Now I could crop in, there's a little too much on this edge, right? So I could go here, I could go here. And I'm bringing out interesting characteristics of this that just make it more distinct. But as I'm looking at this scene, I'm thinking, oh, this would be really cool if we had like a model or 3 people like sitting on this log, right? Now we would be drawn to that. You see what I'm saying? So I can do really interesting things with this particular photo, and then I could mix up, we could mix up the dynamic range and how that affects. We could bring out more detail on the stone. Every click we do is adding a layer. And then, yes, a lot of these, when you think about a photo, we've gotten so used to thinking about photos in terms of, will it get likes on Instagram? And a lot of times these kind of photos, people aren't used to them. They're used to shock and awe, bikini models, these over-the-top landscapes that are too perfect to be real. And now AI, like now we're competing with stuff that is completely fake, but people think that that's reality. It's not. So what we have to do is start searching for emotion. So sometimes when you post these more ethereal kind of images right now, they don't get the immediate response. They're going back to that fine art era that people have kind of forgotten about. But the more we do them, the more we start to connect with that. I think my mic battery is going to go dead here very soon. So I'm watching. If I go silent for a second, I will swap those batteries, okay? And so once you understand how to look for that, and I might come back to here. Now, if I was the modern normal photographer, I would say, hey, I want some people sitting on here. Let's do generative AI. I don't care. I don't want AI. I want feeling. I want emotion. So now I have this idea in my head. If I'm ever back here with a model, I'll have them sit on the log. And I'll shoot a very similar scene to that. And then I'll come back and edit it this way. Doesn't mean I can't use this photo here. It just means like every time I see something, I see different. And what happens when you do these There it is. There it is, sorry. You guys only talk when something breaks. That's why I keep letting things break, because you're not giving me enough feedback to know where you want to go with this, okay? No, we're good. Look, this is the first time I've done this particular class, and we'll probably do some more. I hope you guys will come next time, because I really was editing today, and I'm like, yes, we got to do a workshop on this. So I'm going to refine this workshop and do more with it. But let's go back to this photo. What I'm getting at here is I can go through, and I'll do this all the time, and try different film looks, let's say. And here's a Cine 400 kind of look. And it brings out this warmth and kind of beauty. But you don't always want, and what I was saying is when you do a pictorialist edit, you have a model in a flowing dress. Maybe there's a little bit of implied nudity. You have a street scene where there's just a man walking by a building. Sometimes things that could be a little boring maybe, or a little plain, a little ordinary, or maybe in the case of models sometimes, like, it's like, no, I wouldn't post this photo this way because I want it to be fine art. I don't want it to feel at all trashy or anything like that. What you're doing is you're drawing out the emotion, the feeling, the form, the soul of the image, and actually reducing at times detail or darkening, drawing focus. You see what I'm saying? Pictorialism is about finding the feeling. Let's take this, right? So I just did a filmist edit on this and lighten the exposure up a little bit. But let's take it into Photoshop and let's do Pictorialist and just run this, okay? Let's just run this and let's do, we could do Hamilton, and that would bring kind of this soft glow to this kind of grassy plains kind of look. This is nice. And I could even go lighter on this, right? We could actually go to our layers. Let's go down to the H-curve layer and just even turn it up a little bit brighter to lighten her up. Now, this is something you saw in a lot of Hamilton stuff where you had these very light contrasty areas, and it's worth looking at the way that these different photographers did this image. This is after sunset, so we have kind of this softness going on, right? Let's snapshot that, and now I'm going to do Hamilton Rich. Hamilton Rich is one of my favorites after Hamilton because it really kind of harnesses that, not monochrome, but so warm and so glowing that it could almost feel monochrome, right? There's still color there. And Hamilton did a lot of that kind of work, okay? This one runs a little slow because it's using blurs and things like that. Now, I could also adjust the opacity overall so that I could click the actions and this would adjust the master opacity of the main group, right? Good building of actions and organizing. This is what saves you also hours and hours and hours. Everything's always going to be organized. And then when I'm done, if I want to save it and not save all those layers, I'll just click the merge to one layer button and I'll get this one layer. And now I'm not saving this huge, huge layer, okay? But for purposes of this, let's not merge just yet. So Hamilton Rich on this really dark scene is a little intense, right? Here's a snapshot. I'll often make snapshots along the way. I kind of like the normal one, but let's reset to where we started, the base, and let's run something like Coburn. Now we're gonna start getting this strong focus, this emphasis that's more about the shadow, right? And so things start disappearing. Let's try Stieglitz and do the same thing. And sometimes if I don't know exactly what I want, I'll just play around. I'll usually start with these master combos, which are running lots of the of combinations and settings and actions. But you can also go down and just manually add individual textures and settings. But you see what's happening here. The more grit, the more tarnish I add to this, the more we actually have something that feels emotional. We're taking advantage of the fact that this eye is really dark and this eye has a catch light. Now, personally, between the two that we just did, the one that really pops out to me is this one, because it really has almost that, it's a photograph. It's clearly a photograph, but it almost has that charcoal kind of feel. The background kind of fades into oblivion, but you still feel that jungle. You see what I'm saying? I want you guys to try this on your photos, and maybe we'll do, more of this kind of workshop. I want you to leave in the comments. Maybe you're watching this after. You let me know in the comments. I don't want this to be over an hour, and we're going to wrap this up. If you have any questions, throw them in now. We've edited landscapes. We've edited behind-the-scenes photos. We've edited fashion, right? And ultimately, the whole goal of all of these is to say, no, we're going to create something distinct. We're not going to worry too much about what other things detailed. We're going to let that dream state kind of come out. People's minds are way more than we realize. The universe is way more than we realize, and emotions are way more than we realize. And as photographers, I think those are details that we need to be looking for. I think we need to be looking for ways to connect with people here, especially in an era where people can literally type in a prompt on their phone and automatically generate any image they can possibly imagine. It's not real, but they're still doing it. And so I think if we want our photos to stand out, they need to be real moments in time, real places. We need less fakery. We need less pasted in skies. People are sick of it. People are tired of this. And people are starting to lash back on these landscape groups, and they're saying, this is fake, this is AI, we don't want to see this. Because it's not a photograph. It's not a real place. And pictorialism is. Pictorialism is saying, we have no limit to our creativity, we can do whatever we want, but this is something, someone, and someplace real. As to analog effects, I haven't used it. I don't love the way plugins works, and this is why I always say that my tools are plugin free. This is what happens. A lot of people do like gritty effects, but I like to go to the root of things. So when I studied zones, I went back to Ansel Adams and Fred Archer. I studied zones, and then I brought those to the digital age. And then now I think Nick uses zones in their silver effects. A lot of the luminosity masking plugins, those have started using zones, right? No one cared about zones up until around 2011, 2012. And I'm not saying I was the only one, but I was one of the ones in the podcast and in my various things, like heavily pushing zones, saying we need this, okay? When you take and you start doing these, you're gonna find that it's more than just a plugin. I find that when we use a plugin, what tends to kind of happen is we get a little bit of sterileness that I don't love, right? We get a little bit of, hey, you can run this and then you get a flat layer. That's the opposite of what's happening in Pictorialist. When you go to Pictorialist, I'm not trying to say click here, and click here. You're gonna do that and it's going to work because I've literally spent months adjusting this, and I'll spend months more adjusting it to keep doing it. So it's not that you can't just go in and say, I'm gonna do 3 clicks and I'm gonna add a texture and here I'm gonna have a Pictorialist, right? And you can edit this stuff in all of these different ways, and each one's gonna come out different, and it's gonna create dynamically. In fact, I have textures and stuff being created randomly as Pictorialist is running, because I don't want any edit to look the same as the one before it. If you go to Pictorialist and you edit, and you come back a week later and you edit, and you think you're using the same actions, maybe you click the same actions, but they might be in a slightly different order. You might adjust a layer differently. Maybe you do them exactly the same. It's probably still not going to come out the same. And that's the beauty here, is there is an organic feel, but you also have all the ability to micro adjust. And I always say, like with actions, people are like, oh, I don't use Photoshop, I'm scared of Photoshop. Then use actions. Because what it does is something like Pictorialist, I don't care if you're new to Photoshop or you're a master at it and you teach classes. It's doing hundreds of steps in seconds. So you can use it as is, but if you say, hey, no, I'm gonna go play with the blending modes, and the more you use it, even if you're a Photoshop newbie, you're gonna realize, like I show in my Photoshop Fast course, oh, this Photoshop, for what I'm doing, isn't actually that complex of a thing, right? And so I'm not going to compare it completely. I'm not saying Nick doesn't make good stuff or anything like that. But over the years, in my early days, like those were the thing that everybody was using. And what usually happens is it kind of locks you in, right? You can mix and you can adjust, and then you end up with this flat layer. And that's not how Pictorialist works. You can run Orton, you can run Stieglitz, you can run Hamilton, then you can add a micro bloom layer to it. You can adjust the black mist. Like, you're doing all this stuff, and so each time you're doing it, it's as much or as little as you want, and you're making it your own. And I think the key with Pictorialism is kind of that feel. Whether it's Saul Letter, Damachi, Stieglitz, Coburn, Misson, and I'm studying all of these and looking at the distinctions between them, right? Think about how they use, look at this here. Look at this use of blur, steam coming from a cup, right? We live in a world where now this would just be created with AI, but there's something real here. And so yes, Pictorialism starts in camera and how you plan the shot. But I promise you, you're gonna, if you go and use Pictorialist, you're gonna start going back to photos and just start browsing through photos. Go look for photos that are a little weird. I promise, you're gonna be surprised. Go look for photos that just, your mind always comes back to them, but it was never quite right. The shadow was never quite right. The light was never quite right. And start running some Pictorialist tools on them. And you might be shocked with how you feel. And then go over to the Shadow Hunters group on Facebook and share what you discover. And there's a link to that actually in the video description, to the Shadow Hunters group if you're not a member. Okay? And yes, Path of Bree, the micro adjustment is really important, because once you have, and this is the key that people don't realize, and this is why there's no way you can even come close to this in Lightroom and Capture One. I can't even do this in Affinity. Right? It's just the nuance of creating actions and scripts is not there. These are actually incredibly complex actions. And one action's running within another, and there's a support action over here. But the reason I do this is not to make them complex or hard to dissect. I'm always trying to show you guys how to do this manually. You can use blending modes, blurs, textures, and create your own variants of this. I just went in and said, hey, I want to create Pictorialism. How can we do more with that, right? And some images might speak to you and some don't. You might say, well, I prefer the nice bright boats. This is actually the Orton effect. So this is still a Pictorialism kind of feel versus not the same photo, but the same lake and the more Stieglitz vintage scratchy look. But they both have a drama in their own way that's actually powerful. And the same with the photos of our models, right? If you take these different photos, some are color, some are black and white, they each have different senses of feeling. Hamilton, here again, right? Stieglitz, Coburn. Notice how each one of these has a different nuance, and it's not like you're copying a Coburn photo. We're just kind of taking the tonality, the way that they use the darkroom tools, and I'm saying, how can we bring that into the digital world? That's what Pictorialism, I think, is about for us now. And I think it's a huge, those of us who get on this band, I promise you guys, it's always the same. Pretty soon, other people are going to start doing videos about this. They'll start implementing it into their plugins and all this kind of stuff. And this is okay. This is why I have a YouTube channel. Even though I don't have the most following, when you combine the podcast and you guys in the groups, and even though it's kind of a small group of us here that watch these videos, we're influencers in our own space, and we go out and create this stuff and talk about this stuff. You take zones, you take shadow hunting, like I teach in Shadow Hackers. You start talking about Pictorialism, and pretty soon we come back and we're learning again from the past, just like we learned from film, just like we learned from the early photographers. Pictorialism was the earliest decades of photography, and them discovering how to be inspired by the painters, but also be our own people, our own artists. And I think we really have to throw out in this AI world, we got to digital and everything else we just forgot about. Now we're starting to realize, hey, digital's great, but we can't just ignore everything from the past and all these techniques. That's what I did with Pictorialist, is said, let's bring those techniques to now, and the results we're gonna get from them are and will be amazing. These are doing things to photos that I would say, this photo's fine, but it doesn't have my feeling. I call this, I don't know what I call this. What's a word for this? There's a cognitive dissonance, I think, between the photo I had in my heart, in my mind's eye, that maybe connects to me emotionally in some way in the photo on the screen or on the print. And I know you have photos that just do the same thing. And so you always come back to those photos thinking, what can I do with this? And then you maybe share them, but they just don't convey that emotion and no one responds to them. I know you've done this. I know I've done this. It's super common. And yes, you can, by the way, you can mix Blackroom. You can mix Loomis. I would do this as the pre-edit, right? Just like I use a preset on a photo first in Lightroom and then I go to Photoshop. If I wanted to work with the zones, I would use Loomis first because it's not doing any crazy effects. It's all about adjusting the light. Then maybe I would go to Blackroom and even do more. And then I go, for example, usually I'll use Emulsion 4. If I want a true platinum print look, I'll go to Emulsion 4 after Blackroom as a finishing step. In the same way, I'm using Pictorialist as a finishing step. I'm going to do my basic color grade and maybe even other tools in Photoshop like Loomis to adjust tone values, but I don't overthink it. Because Pictorialism is about low fidelity, not overthinking the details, sometimes I'll just grab it and I'll be like, oh, let's work this. Okay, yeah, Portrait 400 works fine on this. I'm not feeling it on the raw file. Let's go and run a Hamilton. Let's go and run. It's a really experimental process. And I think that's kind of getting back, even though these are actions and they automate a lot of the work, or maybe you're doing it manually like I've talked about. I think part of the beauty of doing Pictorialism digital, just like in the darkroom, is we're still experimenting. We're seeing, like we're moving around the shadow until it hits us here and it feels right. And yes, thank you, Josh. I like the idea of making throwaway shots into fine art. Yes, but I would encourage us not to think that way. Go take those shots. To me, no shot is a throwaway. A lot of times I'll go back to these photos and I'll remember taking that photo and remember the feeling of it. And so it's not a throwaway to me. I'm not saying you can't. Yes, you're definitely going to be able to take Pictorialist and take images that you would not otherwise have used, they wouldn't have worked, and suddenly there's going to be a magic to them. I just want to encourage us to not be spray and pray, right? And to not think, okay, I can be really sloppy in my photos and then use effects. And this is kind of what plugins and digital has encouraged us to do for years. Just push the slider to the right. And you know that's the opposite of my theory in photography. So yes, I too am finding shots that, I hate to use the word, but maybe were throwaways because they just didn't work. But I didn't delete them for a reason. I never delete almost any photo for a reason. Occasionally if it's just completely blurry or something like that. Maybe I shouldn't even do that. But I rarely delete even the rejects from a shoot because storage isn't that expensive. So I keep working and working. And sometimes I literally on some of these I'm showing you today, I came back after years and said, oh, now it works. This is what I was looking for. So when I create tools, I'm always looking for tools to help me discover more about myself, to help you discover more about yourself. Yes, to make us faster, to make us more creative, to separate us from AI fakery, but to help us discover things about the photos that we didn't see before or that we couldn't quite reach before. Sometimes the vision is here, but it's not here. And tools like this change that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm going to call it a day. If you don't have Pictorialist, I do encourage you to check it out, depending on when you're watching this. And right now, if you're watching this while it's live or soon after, Pictorialist is got a huge sale going on for the launch deal. So definitely go check out Pictorialist. You won't regret it. It's guaranteed. Like all my products, it will change the way you see. Doesn't mean you'll use it on every single photo. That's not the point. But you will take, and not only that, as you start using it, you won't just go and look away for photos that didn't work and do pictorials with them. You'll start shooting for that emotion and for that pictorialism, and that's going to transform how you see. Let me know if you have any questions. If you have Pictorialist or you grab Pictorialist, on the Pictorialist page, there's tabs at the top and there's hands-on videos, because I didn't actually give you all the exact fundamentals of how to install and use Pictorialist. I really wanted to focus on the art of pictorialism today and the kind of the spirit of pictorialism rather than whether you use my actions. But I certainly appreciate you checking them out, and there's hands-on instructional videos over there on the site as well. I'm going to call it good for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Join the Shadow Hunters group in the description, and you can also find Pictorialist in the description of this video. And this particular video, a lot of my live workshops are not, because I want them to be a live interactive for each group. But for now, at least, I'm going to leave this video up so those of you that didn't catch the whole thing can come back and watch it in a few minutes here. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you all for the comments and for being here. Sorry for the technical issues. I just wanted to keep you on your toes. We'll see you next time. Peace.